In Austin, the Mercedes powerhouse, led by the indomitable Lewis Hamilton, faced a cataclysmic disaster as he was disqualified from the race. His struggling teammate George Russell teetered on the brink of the same abyss, escaping by sheer luck. The disparity between the two this season has been shocking, and a year since Russell's maiden victory, he now faces a ruthless thrashing by his relentless teammate at every race. George has given the rest of the grid a warning for the sprint weekend, but is he the one who needs to be careful? Today we'll talk about the threats facing every team this weekend and the warnings George Russell needs to heed, so don't go anywhere. The races are coming thick and fast at the moment, and the United States Grand Prix in Austin already feels like it was months ago. It was actually just 2 weeks past that the FIA disqualified Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc for having cars that didn't abide by the sport's technical regulations. The planks of both their cars had worn more during the course of the weekend than is allowed. There was some controversy after the race as the question of whether other cars should have been checked came up. If Lewis Hamilton was in breach of the technical regulations, then surely George Russell would have been as well. And what about Carlos Sainz? Should he have not been checked as well? With 2 of the 4 cars checked being in breach of the rules, some even said that every car on the grid should have been assessed. In the end, nothing came of the questions, and we moved on to the Mexican Grand Prix with no further disqualifications or rule changes. This weekend, though, we have another sprint race. During sprint weekends, teams only get FP1 to sort out their setup for the weekend before going into Parc Ferme. On a traditional race weekend, they would have FP1, 2, and 3 to dial everything in. The reduced time available to work out what ride height to set their cars up in Austin led to Mercedes and Ferrari making mistakes. But the reduced time wasn't the only factor. On a sprint weekend, there are 4 competitive sessions that run under Parc Ferme, while there are only 2 on a traditional weekend. So, on a traditional weekend, you could fit a new plank to the car before qualifying and only have to do 2 sessions with it fitted. On a sprint weekend though, because you can't change parts after FP1 without being penalised, the plank has to survive 4 competitive sessions without getting worn more than 1mm. And during those competitive sessions, the cars are hammering round the track, taking curbs where they can and getting compressed into the track by the insane amount of downforce they generate. The planks take a beating on a normal weekend, but with twice as many sessions for them to survive during a sprint, whether they'll survive or not is always a close run thing. After the 2 disqualifications 2 weeks ago, George Russell has issued a warning to the rest of the grid. He says there's a chance that the scrutineers could discover cars failing foul of the plank wear limit after Sunday's Grand Prix in Interlagos. It's going to be really challenging, Russell admitted. And this is a big issue with the sprint weekends because, as we said in Austin, we ended practice, we did our checks, and there was no plank wear, and we thought we were in the clear. And then, with a small change of wind direction, putting in 100 kilos of fuel in the car for the first time, some laps in traffic, some laps not in traffic on a really bumpy circuit, we found ourselves in an issue we weren't expecting. I've got to be honest, on a track like this, some teams might find themselves in the same place, so that's just part of the game in a sprint race. We now know that the FIA decided to check more cars in Austin because of the feedback from sensors in the car that said that the whole field had experienced greater vertical oscillation than normal. That's a fancy way of saying they bounced more than normal. While the track at Sao Paulo is in a better state than the Circuit of the Americas, it's certainly not the smoothest on the calendar. The teams will know that the FIA will be on the lookout for offending cars. You wouldn't expect any of them to make the same mistake twice in 2 weeks, but there will be consequences. Mercedes was so competitive in Austin because they were running their car so much closer to the track surface than Red Bull, not that it worked out for them. The RB19 does not like running with a high ground clearance, which means they could be vulnerable to only their 2nd loss of the season. Russell won last year's Brazilian Grand Prix, his maiden Grand Prix win, after the dominant Red Bull of Max Verstappen struggled for pace over the weekend, later admitting to having been locked into a setup that was not ideal. Red Bull definitely took a step backwards this time last year, and it just goes to show, in these sprint races, if you were to make a bad choice, you're locked in and you can't rectify those mistakes, Russell said. This year is different though. When George took Mercedes' only win of the season last year, many hailed it as an ascension. He was brought into the team to be a replacement for Lewis Hamilton when the time comes, but since that win, George's form has been poor in comparison to his 7-time world champion teammate. In 2021, Russell went to the media with comments about the then Mercedes driver Valtteri Bottas's performance. It was just after George had wiped out Bottas in Imola and slapped the Finnish driver's helmet as he sat in his wrecked car. He said, "He's in 9th position, which for a Mercedes driver is nothing. He needs to be fighting for podiums and victories every single race. He would go on to replace Bottas that winter, but after comments like that one, he set very, very high expectations for himself. At first, he seemed to be meeting them and would eventually beat Lewis Hamilton in the Drivers' Championship by 35 points in 2022, as well as securing the team's only victory. There were differences in setups and experimental parts and all of that, but it was still impressive for a young driver matched up against the sport's most successful ever. It was just under a year ago that George Russell leapt atop his Mercedes W13, having just won his first Grand Prix in Sao Paulo, unleashing a wave of euphoria from the Mercedes garage. The future had arrived at Mercedes, but since then, the team has seen that the grass is definitely not greener on the other side. In races they've both finished since Brazil 2022, Lewis has beaten George in all but 5 of them. In Mexico last week, he was lucky to finish ahead of Daniel Ricciardo, who would have got him if the race had lasted another lap. 1 week earlier, at the Circuit of the Americas, the pace difference had also been clear. Both cars had been given the same significant floor upgrade, but Hamilton out-qualified and out-raced Russell during both the sprint and the Grand Prix itself. On the road, George finished in 7th before his position was inflated by the disqualifications ahead of him. I'm sure if the FIA had taken a look at his car though, his result would have been voided as well. His 1 podium this season is an extremely poor return in comparison to his teammate's 6. Should we play the Imola 2021 comments back to him, or does someone else want to? The driving mistakes, like that one in Imola 2 years ago, have been extremely costly this year. A clumsy error in Canada meant George's Mercedes hit the wall hard at turn 9 and he later retired. Hamilton finished 3rd. While in pursuit of Lando Norris for 2nd in Singapore, he tapped the wall at turn 10 and went nose first into the barrier. Hamilton finished 3rd again. Some people have started referring to it as the Hamilton effect. While Jenson Button, Nico Rosberg and Russell may have beaten him in the championship, each only managed it once, and the effort of doing so led Rosberg into immediate retirement. Even F1's perhaps most self-confident driver Fernando Alonso found himself challenged in 2007 by the sheer pace of his rookie teammate Hamilton. Consistently beating Hamilton has proven beyond any teammate so far, as the 7-time champion's ability to sense, adapt and strategize remains at a heightened level. Last season, some of George's success was attributed to his ability to drive an underperforming car, after 3 years at Williams driving backmarker cars. Hamilton had had the luxury of driving the best car on the grid for 8 years. The W14 is apparently an absolute diva, even harder to drive than last year's, but Hamilton is making the most of it while Russell struggles for pace most weekends. Russell made the excuse that the frustration of driving a Mercedes but being unable to compete for wins has caused him to overdrive the car, but has also potentially affected his mental approach. It was quite clear this year from the beginning that we were not going to be fighting for a championship, and I don't know if that's had an impact on my mentality or not, he said following the Singapore Grand Prix crash. There is a reason for all mistakes, and that is just pushing to the limit, and in some instances pushing over the limit to try and achieve what is possible. Does every F1 driver not always try to push the limits though? Is it not the ability to push to the limit, not beyond, that sets the great F1 drivers apart from the good ones? George competing with Hamilton for a title would be something to watch, although it's an attitude that many of Hamilton's teammates have arrived with. On good days I could beat Lewis, no problem, said Valtteri Bottas. But his base level was so high that he could just pull off the performances he needed. It's very hard to accept because every driver rates himself very highly. It is easy to judge Lewis's teammates from the outside, but until you're in that situation, you aren't ever going to know what it feels like to try everything you can and still be beaten. George was in that situation in 2021, making comments about Bottas without understanding the situation he was in. I'm sure he understands now though, and perhaps it is time for him to heed his own warning. Do you think George is ever going to be able to beat Hamilton over a season again? And will we see some more cars disqualified this weekend for breaking the technical regulations? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and if you want more F1 news and analysis like this, make sure to subscribe. Until next time, drive safe and bye for now.